to make it clear.
Order. I did not make the comments.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, she is the spokesperson for social development from the government in waiting, Labour Party list MP and high-ranking Jedi Knight, Jacinda Ardern, and he is the editor of independent news site livenews.co.nz, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1. Will Auckland finally get an inner city rail loop, or will central government crush it? And how will the super city fund it? Issue 2. Mayor Len Brown has committed to tackling the booze culture, while the Prime Minister doubts minimum price alcohol will make a difference. How are we going to tackle Auckland's alcoholism? And Issue 3. The latest social welfare reforms. Benny bashing to distract from asset sales or necessary tough love? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with Issue 1. Thanks to Mayor Len Brown, the issue of Auckland gaining a public transport system that actually works has not been allowed to be smothered by central government. But how is the super city going to fund the Selwyn? The government won't let councils borrow more for public transport infrastructure. Baby-faced assassin Cameron Brewer won't let councils raise rates for public transport infrastructure. So what assets will the super city need to sell to be able to afford this?
Well, if they keep their mind and they keep their focus, they will not sell any of the assets. The city needs the assets that it has. If this undercurrent that is currently within the National Party circles to flick the ports of Auckland off and have the business move to Marsden Point and Tauranga gains any kind of traction, then Auckland is in the medium term and long term will be suffering because of that. I think the challenge is here that this super city structure is a recent piece of legislation, obviously. It's flawed in all sorts of ways. It needs to go back to Parliament. Even if Auckland City councillors draft some sort of draft, put together a draft legislation and say, this is what we need to fix this whole thing here. There are inequalities in the whole thing. Clearly the emphasis, even from your question, illustrates and underscores the focus is on the CBD. This city is huge. The south side of the city are moaning because they're being overridden by what they say are the mothership.
That's right.
West is not getting the identity it once did. And I think the whole thing is a mess bomber. It is too soon to say, flick that piece of asset off, that should go. That is a disaster.
But the super city was designed to be able to carve up Auckland's assets and sell them off as quickly as possible. That was what it was designed to do.
But we do not need to buy into the Rodney Hyde Act plan. Yes, we've seen ACT people planted into this isthmus, down Papakura district, and experimenting with the ideology and to see how it works. Well, we've got a super city structure, and in some ways it was a pragmatic kind of move to get everybody talking on one level playing field. But what we have seen is inequalities, as we just illustrated before, into the whole thing. And I do think it needs to go back to Wellington and a rethink.
Just forget that the super city was designed, of course, from the rights perspective, to have John Banks as
well. Exactly. Certainly not Len Brown, right? Certainly not that. He was not the mayor who was supposed to win.
And that's why I think we're seeing, the issue with the way that it's being structured and the way that Len's trying to govern. And it ideally needs a partnership between central and local government, and that's what we're desperately lacking. And I think that's quite obvious.
Why did National set it up if they're not going to listen to the bloody thing? I mean, he's very clear he's got a mandate for public transport. Is it just because the wrong mayor won?
I think ultimately that might be a huge part of it, but also the wrong agenda one, really.
Right.
So Joyce's agenda for Auckland was to have a transport projects that sat within his view of economic development and road user needs, which is build more roads and more roads preferably leading out to National Party electorates. So for instance, the roads of national significance, I think deeply flawed into where we're pumping just millions of dollars, and that is at a cost to other transport priorities. So what I think needs to change is NZTA funding basically is ring-fenced for roads. That needs to be opened up, and if we had competition across all modes of transport, I think you'd see the City Rail Link be #1 priority for Auckland.
Jacinda, if all roads lead to Rome, why is it that all roads Stephen Joyce seems to build lead to Mitre 10? Have we managed politically to separate transport strategies away from vested corporate interests towards public commuters.
You mean away from a bit of pork barrel politics as well?
I mean, pork barrel politics have always been a problem with New Zealand, but it seems to be much worse now.
Yeah, I think it feels worse. And you know, one of the reasons I think it feels worse is because New Zealanders are actually demonstrating their demand for public transport in a way that we haven't seen before. So as much as Stephen Joyce stands up and says, I'm building roads because people want roads, well, actually that's not true anymore. People are showing that because the pressure on their hip pocket to keep a car on the road means that they actually, for fiscal reasons, need to be using public transport much more. So we do, I mean, I think it's time for him to start waking up and responding to what is a demand-based issue now.
So when Transport Minister Jerry Brownlee says he won't commit taxpayer money to this project, how is Auckland supposed to pick up the economic dead weight of our second largest city, Christchurch, being knocked out of action because of the earthquakes, if investment isn't going into Auckland's infrastructure?
Well, you know, there is a grand problem with this whole thing, and once again, you know, the Auckland cannot deliver for the whole of the country and such things. Yes, we all agree, I think, that we need to actually streamline the roading systems. We need to unlock, perhaps, you know, the congestion at peak hour and unleash, you know, the economic kind of benefits to that. But I think there are a couple of things running here, and one of them first is that really the National Party says various things, and you know, and then it backs off them. I remember in 2008, it got quite a strong mandate itself to actually be the government that was going to invest in infrastructure around the country.
That's right.
Now, what we have seen since 2008, I think, is many people coming back to New Zealand from overseas in the Northern Hemisphere with big money, and we can see the Auckland prices of housing going up quite considerably, perhaps pushed by that phenomenon. They have seen what the lifestyles are in Europe, they've seen what the lifestyles are in London, they've seen that in Paris, etc., etc. They're coming back here and they're thinking, locked up roads with cars is just not working. We demand and we want a modern, efficient city. And one of these things, this is what I think is behind that plan. National's challenge is to try and meet that. All this talk that Nikki Kay is focused on relating to developing the inner city culture, now that's fine for a Auckland Central type of MP. But that's doing nothing for the grand plan. And once again, let's start to actually acknowledge that Auckland stretches all the way down to Bombay here, into Franklin, and way up the north. And we need to actually work that whole plan out.
Jacinda, Wellington has done more to frustrate Auckland's infrastructure needs than any other group. Would a 2014 Labour government cement into place funding for Auckland's infrastructure?
Yeah, well, we've already said that, for instance, the Pūhoi to Wellsford for us is not a priority. And so that would be a simple reprioritisation of what is a over $1 billion infrastructure plan and putting that into funding for the City Rail Link. And that makes absolute sense. But I think actually, Bomber, if you just say, well, let's let these transport projects stand on their own merits and allow them to, you know, compete against one another for the NZTA funding, then actually most of these projects would, and you wouldn't see a lot of these roads of national interest, I think, being pursued. So it's simply a matter of allowing that competition across the modes, across rail, across the traditional car, road, highway, and also including cycling, walking, busing as well.
Now, the irony is too, I think, that the National Party's plan and hope and want to move the ports off its current spot and place them perhaps up to Marsden Point. One of the things that they're going to have to do if they pull that coup off is to actually develop rail systems to the north.
Right.
You know, so in some ways you're kind of thinking, why are they hedging on what the people's want is here in Auckland? Maybe the answer is because they want to put a bit aside for their grand plan.
Well, National actually wants to get rid of Northland's freight
Well,
rail system.
So it doesn't make
crazy.
sense, does it?
makes
Maybe
no
Tony
sense.
Friedland is lobbying for all those decades in the
Yes.
freight areas.
Yeah.
The roading and trucks
Exactly,
is paying
exactly.
off.
Just follow the money.
Final, yes, it's always about following the money. Final question, both of you. When will Aucklanders be able to join the 19th century and travel around their city and a city rail loop?
Well, I applaud Len Brown because despite central government trying
Yes.
desperately to thwart his plans, he has just gone ahead and said, look, you know, this is what Auckland needs. Now, I'll either do it on our own terms or we'll do it in partnership. I think it'll happen more quickly in partnership. So I say good on you, Len, but just hold out until Labor leaves the government, and we'll be right there with you.
When are we going to enter the 19th century in Auckland?
Well, if you just heard what Jacinda said there,
Yep.
that if the polls do change, maybe there's a commitment from somebody.
You don't even need to change, just need to keep tracking, Selwyn.
Yeah, the tracking, the
tracking's
red, green,
The trend is
the
important.
red, green voting block.
Yes. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. Mayor Len Brown has committed to tackling the booze culture in the city, while the Prime Minister doubts minimum price alcohol will make a difference. Can we create policy strong enough to resist the power of the booze barons? Jacinda, loss-leading booze in supermarkets, alco pops, fewer advertising restrictions, and 24-hour licensing. Has the alcohol liberalisation of the late 1990s been a terrible failure?
Yeah, I think it certainly contributed to what is an overall binge drinking culture in New Zealand. And I think the use of the word culture there is really important. Certainly the legislation hasn't helped, but we have to keep in mind that there are wider issues at play. Having said that, that's not an excuse for governments not to take on the leadership role that we have and to lead by example and say, well, look, if we know and the evidence tells us that advertising, accessibility and price make a difference, then it's incumbent on us to do something about that. Now, for John Key to conveniently ignore price, I think is extremely disappointing, and he's dismissed it far too readily when bringing in something like minimum pricing, which doesn't affect all alcohol, but targets the cheap alcohol pops that are aimed at kids in particular, that would make a difference. And I think it's disgraceful he's ignoring that opportunity.
Why don't we get any real traction on this bloody issue? Is it because the booze barons just have too much influence?
Well, you know, I mean, politicians are there to make decisions for all the right reasons and to resist influence if it's in the wrong places, you know. And so, you know, I'm an MP. It's a conscience. Some of these issues are conscience votes. I can be lobbied as much as anyone else. I still take the position we should have minimum pricing. So, you know, there's nothing to stop us.
So, in last year, men aged 50 plus accounted for the largest percentage of the alcohol market, with men aged 35 to 49 making up the second largest group, and the majority of binge drinkers are aged over 25. Can we continue to pretend our booze culture is a youth problem?
I think what it is, and I pick up on what Jacinda was saying.
Which age group are you in? You need to declare it yourself.
I think it's quite obvious, you know. But I think, you know, what Jacinda underscored there was the word culture. And what your figures are showing is that there has been a long tail kind of effect here, where the culture, and, you know, the old saying of rugby, racing and beer, that used to be the New Zealand religions. I think, you know, we're seeing a more obvious problem here because of the alcopops. It is a conscious issue, not only for politicians. It's one where everybody in a family and a community kind of takes a stand on. In some ways, I always thought that 20 was too high in age, that 18 was far more, you know, within the particular regulatory structures. I can remember, I mean, in some ways, I'm the wrong person to ask. I grew up in South Auckland. I went to James Cook High School. Someone burnt down a block and we used to make home brew in a prefab out the back when we were kids. But at the same time, I think the answer to this problem is identifying the consequential impact from the particular culture that is showing up on the streets in Auckland. Is it more dangerous now? Is it dangerous for those that are bombed off their heads because of these highly charged alcohols? Is it dangerous for the others who are trying to enjoy a lifestyle of going out in Auckland? Bomber, you live in the central Auckland area, you would know the answers to these. And I think really, just remember, John Banks promised he was going to do something about this when he was Mayor of Auckland. And I just think Auckland City Council should be applauded that they've got the debate going.
Jacinda, just going back to the influence, I mean, watching the vast lobbying that the booze industry exerted upon National to weaken alcohol legislation this time around leads to the question, how do we get the health officials, the people who have to clean up the mess and are having to deal with the consequences of our booze culture, how do we get their voice at the front and heard?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, there have been elements of this debate that I think have been very well verbalised by those groups, and the evidence they have is enormous. But when you have the likes of Peter Gluckman and the Law Commission, which produced the most comprehensive report on alcohol, putting all of the evidence out there, and you have the Prime Minister sit on national television and say, but in Scandinavia they brought in minimum pricing and they still get boozed. You know, how is that actually contributing to the debate? Well, you know, even if you look at Scandinavia, Sweden has very high alcohol prices. People leave the country and go elsewhere. They drive to Denmark. You know, so I would much rather, now that we've got the information out there, to see it being used legitimately and acted upon. And unfortunately, it's just pure ideology and its values.
Yeah,
and John Key just doesn't want to go down
Are we
that
just
path.
ignoring it? Is that what it is?
No, I think the debate is there because we're discussing it too. We're responding to that. It's a community want. What is in absence at the moment are the solution-based policies to deal with it.
Right.
And that's where the choice comes in. And yeah, if ideology is in behind what those choices are, well then fine. But I kind of myself, I would take a pragmatic thing, abandon the ideologies and think, okay, what is going to actually make it better for those? How are we going to entertain people instead of sitting out the back in the car somewhere and getting absolutely bombed off their heads? You know, the message here is a whole culture of people are hungry for entertainment. Now, trying to challenge that and put the solutions in, I think the debate is heading that way, and I would hope it was heading that way.
Well, what sort of ideas are we going to see in the central city? I mean, can we have a 2 a.m. one-way policy with bars?
Yeah.
Do we need as many 24-hour alcohol licences in Auckland?
No.
And do you really need a double shot at 4 a.m.?
No, I don't think so. And, you know, a lot of the publicans and, you know, those who hold the licences, they say the ones that are there at 4 o'clock in the morning are not the problems. You know, they're probably the diehard, you know, or in for the long haul. It's the ones that have got out on the street around 1 o'clock in the morning.
Or it's the ones that have preloaded at home because they could buy really cheap booze at an off licence or a supermarket who's loss leading.
The off licence saturations in the suburbs prior to them driving in is a problem that has been around for 15 years. Why Manukau City Council didn't do something about it? You know, it's had the Wiri Licensing Trust, for example, out there. West's got its equivalents, and North Shore, etc. And the problem now, perhaps with the super cities expanse, it's something that can be coordinated and planned so that in 5 years' time we aren't looking at this problem so much.
Question to both of you, final one on this. What one thing would you promote to force change to deal with our nation's alcoholism? What one thing would you promote?
I would promote greater empowerment to the community around decision making. I mean, they know their communities, they know what will make a difference in their own space. And for me, that also links into the idea of culture. You know, that actually if we give greater community empowerment, that we're putting a little more power and control into local people's hands. But, you know, I think the day that this issue will change for New Zealand will be the day that when on a Monday morning when you're all standing around the water cooler, it won't be considered okay for people to talk about how drunk and blotto they were
That's
on
the
the
litmus
weekend.
test,
That
isn't
will,
it?
for me, when people don't use that as a badge of honour, then I think maybe things will have changed in New Zealand.
What one thing
One
would you be
thing,
pushing for?
you know, we did it with cigarettes, putting some abhorrent, awful kind of photograph on the cover of a cigarette packet. I think that, you know, every bottle, every cask, every container that it, you know, the alcohol, and particularly with the alcohol pops, comes and have photographs that reflect the consequences of absolutely heavy booze binge drinking.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. I don't wish to sound cynical, but it seems that every time the government needs a distraction, we get presented with some oddly draconian measure aimed at beneficiaries. Paula Bennett went on Michael Law's Talk Hate radio show to discuss limiting the reproductive lives of beneficiaries during the larger classroom fiasco. Is drug testing beneficiaries the most pertinent issue right now, or is it convenient Benny bashing Jacinda? One of John Key's aspirational KPIs is to move 23,000 long-term beneficiaries off welfare. Is drug testing for the most widely used illegal drug a means of achieving those reductions? Is it as nasty as that?
Well, I mean, you certainly won't hear the government, I think, clearly state that. But that has been one of my criticisms around this target. Of course, every party in Parliament would want to see those who are out desperately seeking work, who have been relying on government support, find work. No one disputes that. But all I've been asking from the government is show us your pathway, because that's what we're interested in. How is it that we're going to get those off government support and into work? Now, we already know based on evidence that there are 3 barriers to people getting into work. The availability of jobs, and we know that's a massive problem in New Zealand right now. Under Labour, unemployment benefit numbers were just under 18,000.
That's right.
It's now at 50,000. So that's indicative. Second is having the right skills to get into the jobs that are there. If you're underskilled, undertrained, you're not looking at it being very employable. And third, if you're a sole parent in particular, and we've got 112,000 on the DPB, finding childcare you can afford is a massive issue. Now, I'm asking the government, show me how your reforms are tackling those three biggest issues. That's not to say that drug use isn't something we should be looking at, but we're constantly moving away from the big issues in the welfare space, and that's what I really want to see Paula Bennett come back to.
Are you concerned that we're going to start seeing in social welfare the types of tactics that ACC have been accused of, that public servants will be given bonuses if they cut people off?
Yeah.
I mean, are we concerned that we're politicising?
Yeah.
We're politicising our public.
Do you know what my
service?
biggest concern with in welfare? I'm glad you raised this because this hasn't been discussed a lot. Paula Bennett's Work and Income Board, which she's established, has been tasked with doing an actuarial valuation on the cost of the welfare system. Now, we already have a bit of a pie in the, a bit of a finger in the air idea of how much it costs. But the only reason I can see that you would do exactly what's being done in ACC and cost the end-to-end life of people currently on the system for being on the system is if you have some kind of agenda of around potentially carving bits of it off and putting it out to tender, for instance, and saying this is how much we think the system costs us now. Right. If you're able to get someone off it, you'll be able to pocket the difference of the cost. You know, now why are we bringing in consultants to do actuarial evaluations on our welfare system if that's not the track that you're going down? That's my major concern.
And do we then politicise the public service? Do we then are we giving them targets that aren't actually about serving people, but their own ends?
If they're the wrong targets, I mean, I'm all for accountability in the public service and for them to know where you as a government want to go. But for instance, the government's target on rheumatic fever, it's around trying to reduce the rate of rheumatic fever, and they're just swabbing kids at the moment to figure out who's got it and then to treat it at the tail end. I'd be much more interested in a target that said we want to eradicate poverty and get rid of overcrowded housing for kids, because that would stop not only rheumatic fever, it would stop infectious skin diseases, bronchiectasis, it would cover everything. That is a meaningful target.
Selwyn, should we drug test beneficiaries the same day we breath test politicians? I mean, what's more of a danger to the country, a jobless stoner or a pissed politician?
Yeah, well, I think it is a bit rich for the National Party, and remember that ACT is a part of that government, to come out with this policy when it wasn't too long ago that there was ACT staffers in Parliament that are actually sacked for smoking joints in the local toilets. So there's an irony in that whole thing. But I pick up your thing. There's an inequality here, and also why once again is this call gone out from Paula Bennett? And it's to create again emphasis on what we would call an out group. And that does nothing when you stigmatise a particular group. It does nothing to actually solve the problems. I was actually quite encouraged with what Jacinda was saying there. There were 3 points, and each one had a pragmatic base to it. It was solution-based, orientated kind of debate there. I honestly, Bomber, I couldn't add to that. That was well argued. And I think if any of the viewers were sitting there watching this, they would think to themselves, well, that makes sense. I might have voted for National last time. I might have a few of them may have voted for ACT, but they would think that made sense. And I think this is where sometimes, the country is hamstrung by the various parties anchoring themselves into a particular area instead of actually looking at the problems, finding the best way forward, and actually doing the job. Just on one point, I think at the end of the day, the economy is not delivering the jobs for people to go in. That was the same situation in the mid-1990s. At that point in '96, we saw New Zealand First contribute to the government, and we saw a guy called Peter McArdle come across from this area. It was his specialty. By the time he got into a ministerial role, relating to this, he started to say the transition to employment problem is the big problem here. They tried working it, they never ever solved it. I think it is going back to the basics, creating the jobs. We've got the need to have skilled labour, skill people up and get them into Christchurch and get them out here.
Final question, both of you on this then. Is this just Benny bashing to distract attention from the woes the government have elsewhere, is it?
Well, there is an interesting thing that some people may have noticed, that at both the ACC, the classroom and now state asset sales. In every case we've had a new throwaway policy, and interestingly with one of them we actually didn't know I had to get background advice that the Minister had received, and this was around the court order for child protection issues, having the judge tell a parent not to have any more children.
That's right,
we found that the Ministry of Justice had provided no advice on this, and so you get the feeling that sometimes even on Michael Law's show that if we need a distraction we can create it on the spot.
They provided no advice.
They provided no advice, and my position here is that when you're in a position as responsible as a minister, that it is incumbent on you when you start talking about these ideas and these notions, you've got to be really careful that you've at least understand the consequences of what track you're going down.
These are society's most vulnerable after all.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not to say you can't float where there's a valid issue, but if you're pitching a new policy idea...
Is this just Benny bashing?
Yeah, it is. And one of the things that screams out every time we hear something here is the National Party knows that it's going to get support from redneck New Zealanders.
Yeah, they love it.
And the other thing you hear too is why on earth are they putting the boot in once again? It was almost and the focus on women on DPB. I mean, when once again, Bomber, we talked about this last year. Why focus on the women that are in that situation of trying to actually raise their children the best way to get them to reach their potential when there's a male in every equation?
That's right.
I do not see any political rhetoric around trying to pursue the men who, wherever they are, to actually contribute.
During the contraception debate, I had a go.
Fascinating. It's always the woman's fault. Selwyn, what's your final word this week?
All right to do a plug?
Yeah, go for it. Knock yourself out.
On Monday, on the Beatson interview, we'll be interviewing former Manukau City Councillor, current Manurewa Community Board member, Daniel Newman, used to be attached to the Labour Party. He's gravitated to the right in recent times. Now he is saying in a very, very forceful way that those southern sectors of Auckland are being left out, but worse still, that the mothership, as he refers to it, in Auckland Central, is overriding their own budget allocations. But what's interesting here is that's a centre-right, basically, ticket. And they are saying they want to prioritise to develop things that are going to benefit the poor young people in Randwick Park and Manurewa. And that they were overridden by the council, which is centre-left, in saying we want the funds to go to the Botanical Flower Show, which is a regional it's a regional entity. It's got nothing to do with Manurewa except it's located there, and it's not going to address the wants and needs of the people. And there's an interesting thing there where the right seems to be stepping into an area of need.
What time is that?
That would be 7 o'clock on Monday.
Great television. Jacinda, your final word there.
I just wanted to highlight that we've had two really demoralising occurrences in Parliament in the last few weeks. One has obviously been the demise of public television broadcasting, present company excluded, of course, via TVNZ 7 disappearing from our screens. And whilst Labour, of course, has a policy to reinstate public television broadcasting, there is another battle that we're fighting around our state assets and our treasures. And although the legislation has already gone through, we still haven't seen the hammer go down on those assets. So I want to encourage people to keep fighting the fight. And the best way to do that is sign the petition on asset sales, instigate that citizen-initiated referendum, send a message to government. You can do that by contacting your local Labour MP or just showing up a public place like your local market. You're bound to find them there.
Thank you, Jacinda. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word, two quick things this week. The first is that I watched The Block on TV3 last night, and the only question I have to ask is, why are they refurbishing 4 houses in well-to-do Takapuna and not Christchurch where it's actually needed? The second point is league tables. The only tables our kids need have food on them. Child Poverty Action Group pointed out this week that 100,000 New Zealand kids go to school hungry each week. The worst part of this, focusing on the tail crap used to justify charter schools, national standards and the flawed larger classrooms, is that National are actively ignoring that tail. If National was serious about lifting the educational achievements of this tail, they would feed it. No matter how aspirational John Key is, hungry kids don't learn. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.